Well, I'm joined now by the chair of the Scottish Affairs Committee, SNP MP Pete Wishart, Shadow Scotland Office Minister, and Labour MP Paul Sweeney is still with us. And from Aberdeen, we're joined by the Conservative MP David Duguid, who sits on the committee. Pete Wishart, your report, that a lot of the focus was on this idea that perhaps the Scotland Office is past its sell-by date and there should be, I don't know, a Department of Constitutional Affairs or a Department of Nations and the Regions, call it what you like, but it would be there to be a more powerful arbiter between the UK government and the Scottish government. What do you think of that?
Well, I know this has become the highlight of the committee's report, but the report was to look at devolution 20 years on, just to see if the infrastructure and the machinery of intergovernmental relations was fit for purpose as we get into this part of the 21st century. So what we concluded is that relationships are almost broken down, as you said earlier, that there's real issues that needs to be addressed. So we put forward a report with a number of conclusions and recommendations, and we've offered it to the UK government to try and see what they could do with this. And we know the Cabinet Office are currently looking at this, and I know it's the one about the Scotland Office has attracted the headlines.
But what's your view about the issue of the Scottish Office?
Well, I think the Scotland Office and the role of the Secretary of State has not responded to the evolution and devolution in the course of the past 20 years. That what's happening is that most Scottish Government ministers now go direct to their counterparts in Whitehall and miss out the Scotland Office. Now, we say there's a role for the Scotland Office in big set-piece debates such as Scotland Acts and things like the independence referendum, but in the day-to-day arrangements and relationships that go on between Scotland and the UK, it has a limited role. What we suggested, and it's only a suggestion as this goes forward, we said that a review needs to happen to the Scotland Office, and the proposal that we suggested is that we do have, as you said, this Department of Constitutional Affairs, which brings together all the departments across the UK into one department, and that will then have the bilateral discussions and negotiations with the First Ministers, and it's practically happening. And we had David Lidington on. I mean, this is what, in effect, is going on.
Well, he was accepting there are issues, and the other thing we should point out is that in your report you make the point that it's not just British government ministers saying it's not working, that you know, and that they've perhaps withheld information. I mean, I think it was John Swinney in your report admits that the Scottish government's done pretty much the same thing. So it's trust on both sides. David Duguid, what do you think of this idea of maybe getting rid of the Scotland Office and replacing it with a beefed-up Department of Constitutional Affairs?
Well, first of all, I would agree with Pete. I mean, unsurprisingly, I'm on the committee, so we've published this report on behalf of us all. And I would certainly agree with the fact that the relationship between the Scotland Office and the devolved government in Scotland certainly needs a review. I would draw the line, though, at agreeing with Pete when he says that the relationship is completely broken down. And I think, certainly at an official level, I think the evidence we received was from the UK government official civil service and the Scottish government civil service that there have generally been good relations all along. Part of the problem, of course, and Paul might comment on this in a minute, is at the start of devolution you had a Labour government in Westminster and a Labour government in Edinburgh, and so a lot of the structure, if you like, or the process was based on, to a large extent, the goodwill between colleagues across the border, and so that started going potentially wrong when you had an SNP government in Edinburgh and still a Labour government in Westminster, and of course when you get a Conservative an SNP combination, it starts breaking down even further, you could argue.
Right. Just to pick up on that point, Pete Wishart, there isn't a complete breakdown. No, I mean, one of the things your report mentions is, I mean, if you think of all the fuss that was made about Brexit and the translation of rules and regulations into Scots and UK law, there actually does seem to have been, at a technical level, pretty good cooperation between the UK and Scotland.
The report mentions that there's very good relationships between civil servants, though we did note that there's probably a failure to properly understand and comprehend devolution in Whitehall. And a good part of the report addresses that training is required for UK civil servants, so they're kept up to speed with what's happening in devolution. And we've also suggested that there should be much more of a sharing of relationships and working across different legislatures in the UK. So, you know, like I'm not suggesting, and the report doesn't say this, that there's a breakdown in relationships. We say there's an issue, that there's a difficulty just now, and the machinery hasn't not kept up to speed with what's happening, and it needs to be properly reviewed. And we've put forward a few sensible suggestions and recommendations about how this could happen.
What do you think, Paul Sweeney, of the idea of getting rid of the Scotland Office and replacing it with something else?
Well, I think we need to look at how the functions between the devolved administrations and central government in Westminster works. And I think what's clear is there's been a lack of codification of the processes between how different departments in Edinburgh and London work. And I think when you look back at the history of the Scotland Office, which was a massive government department up until the advent of devolution, where St Andrew's House, the Secretary of State for Scotland controlled a huge army of civil servants in Scotland and delivered public services directly. What was seen is, with the advent of the Scottish Parliament, a misfit of how these departments interact with their UK counterparts and how they function together and cooperate together, and an awareness of how each department is interdependent with each other. And I think that's what we need to look at, and that's what Labour's looking at with its constitutional review. So Pauline Bryan's looking into that. She's doing a review into it with a view to have a more federal
but there
codified
seems to be
constitution.
a general feeling, and perhaps that was reflected in that interview I did a few weeks ago with David Liddington, that the current system doesn't adequately take into account the fact that the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament, while part of the UK, have, if you like, got rights of their own and the rights to be consulted, and that they are, even though things at a technical level might work quite well, there's a kind of slight failure to have any formal mechanisms which can, in the case of Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, incorporate those rights and incorporate a mechanism whereby disputes between the various institutions can be sorted out.
I completely agree, and that's why I think it's part of a review of the constitution of the whole UK, and to reform the whole UK, there needs to be a codified set of rules and processes governing all of those issues. And that's what's lacking just now. Kind of devolution, as it evolved from 1999 through to the present, hasn't really. It's been a sort of one side of an equation rather than addressing the rest of the UK's how that interacts with it.
And you would agree with the idea, Pete Wishart, of because again, something that comes up in your report. This is not just because it's the SNP in Holyrood and the Tories in Westminster. Obviously, you can't arbitrate. You're in favour of independence for Scotland, and the Conservative Party isn't in favour of that. It's when there are these more technical issues and issues where you feel you should have been consulted that you think there needs to be some form of arbitration.
Absolutely, and there's, again, getting back to the recommendations and conclusions, a couple of things that we suggested is that the Joint Ministerial Committee, which is the highest level of interaction between the governments, the chair is shared on a rotational basis, that agendas are properly looked at, that arbitration becomes a feature if there's a breakdown in communications and disagreements. We've suggested all these things as a sensible way forward, that we could deal with some of the difficulties. Now, you're never going to get governments to agree on certain issues, but we need to have the machinery in place that accommodates that.
David Duguid, presumably you'd, given you a party to the report, would agree with this idea of arbitration. There was talk in the report of having third parties involved.
I think the last thing the relationship needs is more levels of bureaucracy. I think what it needs, as Paul was saying, there needs to be a codification, a structure that works, regardless of which party is in power in Westminster or in Holyrood or indeed in the other devolved administrations. But the worry I have is, as much as I agree with Pete and the rest of the SNP members on the committee, because we got together and we agreed on this report and the content of the report, I do worry that the SNP as a whole will always have this ambition to create more separation between the two governments in a way that leads to independence.
All right, Luke, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you all very much indeed. Now.